Hello and welcome to another In Our Tax Time, a series of conversations with senior and influential figures in the world of taxation. I'm John Whiting, and in these discussions I'm asking people to look back on their careers, what has helped shape them, what has helped shape the tax world, so we can perhaps see some of the influences that have shaped the tax world that we, so many of us, now work in today. Now today I'm very pleased to welcome John Andrews. John, a very well-known figure, of course, best known perhaps, John, as Low Incomes Tax Reform Group founder and chairman for many years, but we mustn't forget that before that you had a pretty influential career with Coopers, head of tax, past president of the Institute and many other things. So John, although I obviously want to talk about Litrig and all that, perhaps we can start with the pre-Litrig time, which did exist, and perhaps I can ask you the obvious question. What got you into tax in the first place?
I suppose it was an accident. I wasn't a great diligent pupil at school. I was kept on in the third year, sixth form, to do my A-levels to get better grades. And I think I'm probably the only person in the world who has 3 French A-levels, all at the same grade. That then decided me that if I went on to university, I would probably waste my time. So I thought, well, what's glamorous out there? Oh, well, I like the sea, so I'll apply to Customs and Excise, because I fancied being on a boat and going arresting people and smugglers and that sort of stuff. So I applied for that position, and then got a little letter through the post saying, I'm sorry, all the positions in Customs and Excise have been taken up, but if you'd like to join the Inland Revenue, you could go and attend in 3 weeks' time at Bromley 1 Tax Office. I had to look up what the Inland Revenue did. Thought, well, got nothing better to do, why don't I turn up and see what it's all about? So that's what I did. The Revenue, I went in as a TOHG, Tax Officer Higher Grade, and found that the training was excellent, learnt a lot, found it enjoyable, found it challenging, unlike schoolwork, and did a variety of things, post-war credit claims, Schedule A, big ledgers in copperplate handwriting, the PAYE section, then graduated up to the Schedule D and doing capital gains, which was within Schedule D at the time, and found it interesting, challenging, and was given responsibility for 5 people. And you think, well, it was rather frightening, really, but sort of it was the thing to do, and you did it. Then I got transferred up to Dalston, where I suppose the most famous thing I did was to deal with residents of the Balls Pond Roads and so on in that part of the world. I did my first compliance activity, probably because the inspectors were descending downstairs. They descended downstairs quite often at around 4 o'clock. And this is because there was a big snooker table down in the basement of Finsbury Square. So I think, they introduced me to compliance. But then I asked the question, well, what happens now? I had a group of 5 or 6 people I was responsible for. And they said, oh, well, if you're very good, you can wait here for another 3 years within grade, then you can perhaps take an open examination or whatever, and we get 4 or 5 people a year go through that. So I decided, no, that wasn't what I wanted to do anymore. I thought I'd learn what there was to learn. So I applied for a job and in the private sector and got one at a firm called Shipley Blackburn Sutton & Co. in Jermyn Street, doing as a part of their personal tax department. And their specialisation was entertainers.
Right.
had a lot of famous names of the time, and one of my particular treats was dealing with the Tiller Girls, who were one of the famous dance troupes, and a whole range of stunning young ladies. And we didn't have an interview room really, so I was allowed to take them individually to Fortnum and Mason's for a cup of tea and a construction of what they'd done in the last 12 months so that they could put together some sort of accounts for submitting to our friends in the revenue. So that was pretty exciting.
Yes.
But at the time, a lot was happening in tax. We had a new tax called corporation tax.
Because we're now in mid-late 60s.
Yeah, 65.
Mm.
And corporation tax hove into view. And I thought, well, this looks interesting. And I'd started to do examination studies for the ATII.
Mm-hmm.
And I started that in the revenue. And thought that corporation tax was going to become a bit of a thing. And I wanted to have a go at it. So I asked the senior partner there in the tax department, could I do corporation tax as well as personal tax? And he said no. And therefore, I was back to looking who could provide me with that, and I applied for a job at Cooper Brothers and Co. in Gutter Lane. And lo and behold, they allowed me in to do corporation tax. But my difficulty at Cooper's was that I couldn't become a partner because I wasn't a chartered accountant.
Right.
And
Because by now you'd qualified as ATII, but
yes,
you
I was-
hadn't done the
yeah, I'd
accounting.
even done the FTII by
Mm.
examination. I think one of the 4 people or something in 1968 who passed. But the firm kindly allowed me 3 weeks study leave a year to do the chartered accountant exams. So I did that whilst also being senior manager in the corporate area, and managed to get by on those. In fact, got a prize in the first P1, but didn't get the tax prize, much to my annoyance, because Baroness Noakes got the tax prize. But I expect she had more than 3 weeks study leave. I always comfort myself.
I'm sure she did. Obviously you were a partner for many years and eventually became head of the tax practice, but during that time, John, I mean, you'd see tax practice change dramatically, and I think one of the things you didn't solely concentrate on corporation tax, did you, during that time?
Well, no. I mean, I was naive at the time, and the partners invited me to go and, instead of continuing what I was doing, was to go and review whether the firm should enter into the pensions market,
Mm-hmm.
whether we should be advisors on pension schemes, because a lot was happening on pensions at the time. And so they gave me 3 months to study the market of insurance brokers and actuaries, and then come up with a recommendation as to what the firm should do. I did that and recommended that, yes, there was a place for somebody in the middle ground to give advice to both the corporates and to individuals on pensions. And the naive part of my explanation was that they then said, fine, you're now in charge of the pensions department. And so I recruited from insurance companies, and I subsequently recruited actuaries and set up a pensions department. But then found that you couldn't really do pensions alone in our environment, and so tacked on employee benefits into that. Mainstream taxation of directors and employees, senior employees.
And that, of course, I think led you to quite a position in that, and you even wrote a book on it.
Yeah, I did, and by coincidence I happen to have
Yes, do show.
a copy here, and that was the work of Philip Hardman,
Mhm.
who was the chairman of the tax advisory part of the editorial board of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and he invited me onto that. And they said, well, now you're on our advisory board, you've got to write something. And so I said, I'm interested in this subject and I'd like to write it. And writing a book about something which that hadn't really been a Schedule E book before, it made a very good discipline to learn the subject inside out. And I brought this because I'd like to give just to quote a
Please do.
text. I'm an avid watcher of the Public Accounts Committee and their grilling of various tax figures and multinationals and so on. And they talk all the time about the intentions of Parliament. And I always remember this quote, which came from one of the first major Schedule E cases, where Lord Wrenbury said, what does the Act mean? What is the true construction? It is impossible to escape deciding that question of law by saying that the Act is so slovenly and so unintelligible that it is impossible satisfactorily to ascertain and declare its true meaning. And that's a principle I've sort of adopted ever since. Whenever anybody says the intention of Parliament, then I think it's a movable feast.
So, of course, when you left Cooper's, when you retired from there and were thinking of something to do, you lit upon setting up a body that would certainly tussle with authority. So what was really the genesis of Low Incomes Tax Reform Group?
Well, I suppose it was working in tax generally, and seeing the unequal balance of arms between those who knew about tax and those who didn't. And you get that even in the large firms, because I used to have to do all the major negotiations with the nasty bits of HMRC or Inland Revenue, or becoming HMRC's special office, and those sorts of things. Although those give you amusing instances at times. I mean, it tells you a little bit about how you should arrange some of your negotiations. I always used to arrange my negotiations with special office in the afternoons, because you knew that they would have to get on a train at 4 o'clock to get back to Manchester or Edinburgh or Glasgow or wherever, Leeds or wherever they were based. So you knew what time constraint you had for the negotiation. On one occasion we ended up with the inspector looking at his watch, and we hadn't reached an agreement, and in the end we agreed we'd toss up a coin as to who got the last £10,000 of the negotiation. I'm sure that wouldn't be approved by the Public Accounts Committee today.
But you won?
Yes, I did win, but he got his trade.
And you put your double-headed coin back in your pocket?
No, I didn't have a double-headed coin.
But that was a sort of driver for Littrig, or that ethos, and trying to equalise things?
Yeah, equalising.
Did you always see it as a sort of campaigning group?
Not really. It was because in my presidential year, but then I got swept up into doing presidential things, and I suppose the thing I'm quite proud about was doing all the negotiations to get the Institute, or people who belong to the Institute, with the title of Chartered Tax Advisor, which I was leading all the negotiations to get that through. And in my presidential year, I had 4 themes. One was raising quality standards, one was focusing much more on IT, one was supporting the lower paid, and the other one was a thing called Working Together, which was cooperation with HMRC. Um, but supporting lower paid was the most interesting for me. And what I did at the time was to stop the Institute not replying to members of the public who wrote to the Institute. I directed that every letter that came in from a member of the public I would reply to. And I found quite a lot of pensioners writing to the Institute about the problems they were having with the revenue. That struck me as odd. I mean, I hadn't done low income tax work since I was probably in the revenue. And that inspired me to try and get to understand what they were talking about and why there was a problem. And that then drove me to, during my presidential year, to write a couple of letters in the press asking pensioners to provide examples of the difficulties that they were having with the revenue.
Mm-hmm.
That was very naive. I got 800 letters, very few of which gave experience of their difficulties, but gave their problems that they had not yet been able to solve.
Right.
But what that did was to provide an enormous canvas of experience. So I said that I would reply to every one of those 800, and I would try and negotiate with HMRC, was it the Inland Revenue then, on their behalf. And that's what I then set out to do. At the same time, I had come to the end of my presidential term and decided I'd like to volunteer full-time to carry on this sort of work. I managed then to persuade the CIOT Council to give a little bit of funding for that purpose if I became a full-time volunteer. I then went to speak to TaxAid, David Brodie. David, I kept in touch with. David was a student of mine at Cooper's, and I'd kept in touch, and we'd worked together on things at the Mary Ward Trust, and when he wanted to set up TaxAid, we'd had discussions about how he might go about it and what have you. But I wanted to see whether he could be seconded to me if I was going to start the Low Incomes Tax Reform Group. And he and TaxAid, and trustees of, kindly agreed that he could be seconded for 6 months. I don't think I'd have been brave enough to launch off into that without David's help.
Of course, that then perhaps was the genesis where TaxAid remains the advice group, although we'll talk about TOP in a minute, whereas Liturgy becomes the analysis, campaigning, lobbying group.
Yes, that was, I mean, it was too small a pond for charitable bodies to compete against each other in this field, and we were very reluctant to do anything which might do that, but working together was a very desirable and good thing.
So the body gets established, John, and obviously at this point I've got to ask you one of the questions of our age. Is it Liturgy or Litrig?
I traditionally used Litrig, but then some of the volunteers that I called for, like William Norris, who was the head of Allen & Overy's tax practice, always called it Liturgy, and I think probably Leonard Baton, who was another one of the very early volunteers, along with Robin Williamson, Sally West from Age Concern, a whole range of people who are still 17 years later still involved. I use Litrig. It's just easier for me.
We recognise both Littering and liturgy. I'm sure
it
everybody
was-
does. And
It
what-
was a problem getting the name. I regret it now because no one ever spells it correctly. The
Yes.
concept I had was low incomes, tax reform, group.
Hmm.
You know, 3 separate bits. But then everybody leaves the S off income, so it becomes low income tax reform group, which we're not trying to reform.
Low income tax.
Low income tax. We're not campaigning for low income tax.
But it's probably a bit late to change
It's
the name.
a bit late to
It's
change
too
it, but
well
anyway,
established.
people seem to recognise the initials nowadays.
Now, you've referred to a number of the people who are in with you in the
Mm.
early days,
Mm.
and one of the great successes of Littering or liturgy has been the people you attract,
Mm.
and you've achieved a great deal, I think. I mean, what sort of things are you most proud of over that lengthy period that you've been involved
Well, I
with,
think
John?
attracting the individuals was it very important because they were all high quality individuals. I mean, the most unusual recruit was this local authority music advisor who wrote in response to my letter in the press about pensioner problems. One Paddy Millard. And Paddy then, later on, I went to see him and invited him to become a helper, a volunteer, and then later on, obviously, he became a major player, and a major player in the formation of Tax Help for Older People. That was a battle, forming Tax Help for Older People, because it was a recommendation in the first report we ever did, which I have here somewhere. Older
Yes.
people on low incomes, the case for a
I remember it.
friendlier tax system in December '98. And that was a very good report. Most of the work was done by David Brodie and Robin Williamson. I did the technical, probably stuff. And one of the recommendations in that was that the revenue should finance a support service for older people out of the public purse, similar to that which is done in Canada or the United States. And but that received short shrift from the revenue at the time, as a lot of the report did, such that we had to follow it up some 8 months later with another little report called the Taxman's Response. And we were frustrated at the time, and we had another senior level recruit from the revenue, one Keith Deacon, who was a hard man of the revenue, who was the head of operations. And he got very cross about this lack of engagement by his former colleagues and suggested we should have a little poem at the start of the report, which said, "I sent a message to the fish. I told them, this is what I wish. The little fishes of the sea, they sent an answer back to me. The little fish's answer was, we cannot do it, sir, because." "I'm afraid I don't quite understand," said Alice. "It gets easier further on," Humpty Dumpty replied. So that was from Alice Through the Looking Glass, but sort of illustrated a sympathy, a false sympathy coming back from the revenue with no intention for action. So we decided we'd go and get some money of our own we raised it from the Nuffield Foundation, and we set up 2 pilot schemes. One in Wolverhampton run by Robin Williamson, one in Dorset run by Paddy Millard, one a rural and an inner city. And that proved to the revenue that there was a need, which they'd previously denied. We got the statistical evidence and also clear evidence that volunteers working in this way would save them money and would get a better result for them as well.
Which I think is one of the most powerful points that
one
you
of the
make,
most
it
powerful
actually
things.
saves money.
So, going back in time, you asked what I might be proud of. And I think working with TaxAid, but also founding Tax Help for Older People. But we had to float off Tax Help for Older People as a separate charity because I could see that this was going to expand and would take over everything that we were doing, and we really wanted to move on to other categories of low-income people who were suffering disadvantage. And we moved on to students, people with disabilities, migrants, and so on, and selecting particular areas. And
And of course, it's all still going. And those who don't know, TOP, Tax Help for Elder People, Tax Volunteers, it's a significant operation, continues to be. And I suppose I'm bound to ask you, John, do you ever see a time coming when TOP, maybe TaxAid, isn't needed? Or is it just going to be a permanent feature? Should we be able to get the tax system such that it's not
well, I
needed?
think it's like all charities. Charities tend to fill holes where government have decided, for one reason, good reasons and bad, that they don't want to occupy that space. I can't see a time, even in the advanced digital age, where the need for TOP in particular, but Litrig as a whole, would be redundant. I think you and I both know that the one common thing about tax is change.
Yes.
And change needs monitoring, it needs explaining, it needs dealing with, and the most vulnerable people are the ones that need the most support. But because of the way governments operate, they operate an 80-20 rule, and those on the lowest incomes and the poorest are always in the same 20, and they get the tail end of any initiative. And that will, I think, continue into the digital age.
Sure, that's the case. And as you say, we're going to see many developments. I mean, we're sitting here talking at a time of a newish government. How would you like to see the tax system or wider tax and social security system develop over the 5 years of the government?
How I would like it to do is quite different to how I expect it to do. Tax moves slowly, as you know from your work in tax simplification and so on. Brings back the first article. The only time I've appeared on the front page of the Financial Times was in my the first thing I wrote as Institute President was about the dangers to the UK Treasury of the digital age and the ability of multinationals to operate in a very different way across borders. And I recommended that the OECD should be engaged immediately, or else things would gradually get worse over time. And now...
And let's be clear, that was 20 years ago,
That
wasn't
was
it?
in 1997.
18 years ago then, so...
And you think, do people listen, do people learn, do people... and I think that particular area has got a long way to go yet, and everything may depend on who wins the USA elections as to what their attitude is to cooperation on a global basis. So that's an interesting area to watch. But from my area of the low-income population, then one would like to see more compassion, more understanding of what it's like to be somebody getting unintelligible forms. The expectation levels of people, and even if we come into digital, the expectation levels are still going to increase, are unrealistic, bearing in mind the people that we're dealing with. So I'd like to see much more compassion, more understanding coming out of HMRC. I'd also like to see much better information, education in tax. Educate the population up to their maximum levels.
Yes.
We used to have in HMRC's website a lot of very good stuff on it. Difficult to find sometimes, but there was very good stuff. We'd worked together with HMRC for a long time. Now we have, I know, the Noddy's Guide to Taxation, which we call gov.uk, and I think that's got a long way to go.
To be really useful
To be a very useful thing.
Yeah.
At the moment, I don't find it useful at all. In fact, it's misleading and it's wrong technically in parts. And that I don't think is good enough.
John, you set out quite a programme for the government, never mind, and I suspect you plan to stay involved in that. And I think we all know that there's many people, many of whom will never have met you, who really have cause to be grateful for all you've done, particularly in the low incomes field. So, John, thank you very much for sharing some of your experiences and memories of your time as a practitioner, your time as a leading campaigner. Long may you continue to do that, but for the moment, John Andrews, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.